Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kelsey and I'm here today to do part 2 of my January wrap-up.
Oh, hi, thanks for checking in. I'm still a piece of garbage.
So if you didn't watch the first part of this video, I went over the first 7 books I read in the first month of 2020. For this video, we will go over the remaining 10 books I read in January, so let's hop into it. So as you might know, I like to go over some stats in my month-end wrap-up. So for this month, I read 17 books in total, and that comes out to 5,396 pages, which is roughly about 174 pages per day, which is great. We have a monthly average of 3.76 stars, and that comes out to 2 5-star books, 6 4-star books, 9 3-star books, 0 2-star books, and 0 1-star books. So that means I had an overall fantastic reading month. In the month of January, I read from 10 female authors and 7 male authors. 12 of those books were adult and 5 of them were YA. And in regards to format, which is something new I would like to include into my stats, 4 of them were audiobooks, 4 of them were ebooks. Usually ebooks are either from Kindle or from my library, and 9 of them were from my physical TBR. So let's get into the books I read. The first of which was a reread for me, and that is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Of Mice and Men follows 2 men, George and Lenny, as they kind of travel across the California dusty fields as labor workers, and they hustle where they can because George and Lenny would like to own acres of land so that they can have a home to call their own. George and Lenny land these jobs in the Salinas Valley, and it's kind of like the dream for them because their goal of getting this acre of land with a home is within their reach until things unfold. So like I said, this was a reread for me, and I think upon reread, this book really stands the test of time. It made me bawl when I was 16 years old, and again 12 years later. This is probably the only book that I remember making me cry in high school besides Breaking Dawn. We won't go there. Additionally to that, and the reason probably it had such an emotional pull for me, is because I listened to this on audio, and the audiobook is narrated by Gary Sinise. And if you watched my TBR, you know that I love Gary Sinise. So his performance, because he played George in the movie adaptation of the book, just held a stronger pull to me, and the performance was that much more amazing. I always really appreciated how George defends and protects Lenny from other individuals, and that love and protection kind of seeps onto other weaker individuals on the farm. I really appreciated how Steinbeck wrote about the time period in which he was living in and the situations that occurred in the 30s. However, at 28 years old, I am able to see the many problems that this book has for reading it in 2021. Particularly, I think the portrayal of Curly's wife in this book is, she doesn't really have a name. First of all, she's called Curly's wife. She doesn't really have a role in the novel besides being a nuisance. She's constantly being referred to as tart or tramp. She is clearly being abused by her husband, and then her end in the novel, without going into spoilers, is just terrible, and I just ended up feeling really bad for her character. Additionally, Lenny's character is used to pull the readers and have this emotional pull on your heartstrings, and it could be something that is obviously heavily discussed. This character is clearly used to be emotionally devastating, and so while I was clearly emotionally devastated by this book 2 times in my life, I am able to see the issues that it does have. I still think this is a wonderfully written and beautiful book. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, and I would recommend it if you haven't read this classic yet. The next book I read kind of makes me laugh, but it's For Your Consideration, Keanu Reeves by Larissa Zagaris and Kitty Curran. This is essentially just a non-fiction kind of fun book about Keanu Reeves and like who he is, how he's affected pop culture, that kind of thing. So I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. If it were up to me and just like the love I have for Keanu Reeves, I would have given this a 5 stars, but I had to like kind of be a book reviewer, you know, and be objective. There were many essays in this book that I really enjoyed, particularly the one that goes into how Keanu Reeves became such an impactful actor in Hollywood due to the fact that he was white passing and hot. And I think that that was a super interesting take on his career. It was the first essay in the book, so I think that that really paved the way for my expectations of the novel, and I really thought that the essays within this would be more nuanced than they actually are. And I was really expecting some depth to the short essays. However, there were some silly little articles in this book. Like at one point there is a multiple choice quiz. There's also kind of this like Wattpad fanfic within this book, and they made me smile, but they weren't particularly doing something that I cared for. I do think this book is successful in setting up what it was meant to set up, and that was just to be a kind of ode to Keanu Reeves in a fun way. It just showcases a love for Keanu Reeves and really lifted my spirits when I read it, and I'm grateful for that. I would recommend picking this up only if you like Keanu Reeves. I don't think it really brings forward any new ideas. I don't think it will convince you to like Keanu Reeves, because I mean, we all do already. So I just think it's fun and quirky and would recommend if you really enjoy this actor. Then I read my first arc of 2021, and that was Yesterday is History by Kosoko Jackson. This book follows a boy named Andre who needs a liver transplant as soon as possible, and once he receives this liver transplant, he discovers that due to the liver, he is able to time travel. He goes back in time to 1969 and meets a boy named Michael who lives in his home during that time, and then he slips back to present day Boston, where he is kind of intertwined with this family whose son's liver now is in Andre's, and because they are a family of time travelers, they kind of push their other son, Blake, into kind of training Andre about the ins and outs of being a time traveler, if that makes sense. So Andre is kind of in this love triangle between a boy from 1969 and a boy from 2021. So I ended up giving this 3 stars. I really enjoyed the premise of the book, and because of that, the beginning portion of the novel really impressed me. And I'll admit that I even started to feel bad for Andre because he's kind of stuck in the middle between these 2 boys and time, essentially.
Me being proud AF of my pun, haha.
The discussions surrounding time travel, while predictable, were interesting, and I loved the motherly relationship that was forming between Andre and the mother of the boy who donated his liver. But I think this novel's real downfall was its writing. And don't get me wrong, this book was really fast-paced. I did end up reading this in 2 sittings because it was really addicting, but I feel like it was lacking in development. The love triangle that our main character finds himself in and is marketed for this novel occurs really quickly. The first day that the main character meets Michael, the boy from 1969, they are immediately in love and are kind of already arguing about Andre's dreams and ambitions, and it's like, dude, you're from 1969, like, chillax. His relationship with the secondary love interest in this novel made more sense to me, but I think that's only because they had more of like a development, like they just spent more time together, so it just made more sense that they would be together. But even saying that, I just feel like there was no chemistry between any of the love interests and Andre. Were this novel even 100 pages more, I think the development between the characters and their overall personalities would have felt really more developed, and the chemistry I think would have been there. So like I said, I love the premise. I think the idea is there, and I think that it's so fascinating, but I just wish that the execution was done a bit better. Then if you watch my 2021 TBR where I go over the oldest owned books on my TBR, you will see that one of the oldest owned books is Lifelike by Jake Kristoff. So I made it a goal to knock this off my list in January, and I'm happy to say that I did really enjoy this book. I gave it a 3.5 stars because I adored the beginning portion of the novel and I adored the end portion of the novel. Both portions were really intriguing at painting this unique sense of sadness, and the ending definitely tore my heart out because it was so emotional. I think the novel's real downfall is the big chunk in the middle, but I don't think that's due to plot at all. I think if you really enjoy Blade Runner or Mad Max and the conversations and plot that happen within those movies, then the plot of this book will really pull you in. But I think what really threw me off in this book was the slang that the characters speak. I always loved Jake Kristoff's writing, but the way his characters speak always throws me off. There's one specific character in this book that really annoyed me, but all of the characters have this like new slang because they're in this like dystopian USA, and the future language, I guess, felt really eye-rolly to me. Like they spelled California with a K and a Y, and it just felt like there was this lack of creativity in slang that Jay Kristoff could have invented. So because the language and the way the characters spoke felt so silly to me, it was really pulling me out of the story, and I was getting the sense that I wasn't going to like this book as much as I wanted to. Additionally to that, I really feel like the romance in this novel was extremely insta-lovey and had a trope that I absolutely despise in books. It was in Daughter of Smoke and Bone, so if you read that book series, you know what type of love it is, and it just annoys the shit out of me. Despite the negatives, however, the very Blade Runner feel of the book pulled me in once again at the end, and I loved the very heavy connotations of paradise lost within the book. The themes of that poem really run rampant in the book, and they even mention John Milton's name on a couple of occasions, and that just really hit home for the English major in me. So from not thinking I would pick up the sequel of this book during the middle, I am definitely excited to say that I will be giving it a go, just because I loved the AI themes that this book presented, and I would recommend it if any of those things sound fun to you. Then I read a more emotional book for me, more emotionally draining, and that is Carmen Maria Machado's semi-autobiographical experiment book called In the Dream House. Essentially, this book kind of features a lot of literary tropes in it to kind of shape this memoir of emotional and physical abuse by centering the horror of that event in this dreamlike home situation. I think you kind of have to read it to understand really what I'm getting at, but there's a lot of things like Dream House as a lesbian pulp novel, Dream House as an unreliable narrator. So all these literary techniques are used in the book to kind of shape the way she experienced her abuse. So like I said, this book was really emotionally draining for me. I wish I could have given this to Kelsey 10 years ago before she had to experience like one of the hardest moments in her life. And then I wish that I could give it to myself from 8 years ago so that I would know that I'm not alone and that there are other people who go through this and that I was brave and that I will overcome what I was experiencing. So for me, this book was truly an experience to read. Every chapter, I felt as though I was tabbing something just because I related so hard to what was happening. And everything that Machado was saying was so raw and real. Her prose is extremely beautiful. And the creative liberties that she took with this book was really impressive. I really loved the use of second person that is sprinkled throughout this novel because it was way more emotions than I needed, but I think it worked to kind of distance Dream House Carmen from the author that she is today. And it's similar to how our minds work to kind of distance ourselves from the trauma that we are experiencing. There were some chapters that I felt were kind of unrelated. I appreciated the attempt, but I just either couldn't understand them or didn't feel like they personally fit to the narrative. Overall, this was an extremely validating and relieving experience for me. I'm very happy that I read it, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I read probably one of the most disappointing books I read this year, and that is Permanent Record by Mary H.K. Choi. I'm so sad to have said that because Emergency Contact was one of my favorite books from last year, if you watched that video. So before we get into my feelings, I'll talk about what this is about. This is a book that follows a boy named Pablo, and he is living in New York City. He's struggling to pay his rent. He's struggling to pay his student loans. He's unsure if he wants to go back to NYU and works at this like vegan bodega in the overnight shift. One night when he's working at that bodega, he meets a girl named Lee, who turns out to be the very famous pop star Liana Smart. And the two develop this kind of relationship from there. I'll go into the positives first because I really enjoyed the discussions surrounding depression in this novel. It really goes over student debt and this like melancholy quarter life crisis that millennials experience just because we essentially can't afford to go to school, can't afford to live, can't afford to get a job. And I think Pablo was a really interesting main character because of this experience and because of what he was going through. And the fact that he kind of dropped everything in his life to be with this international pop star was both unrealistic but like a tad realistic. Like I feel like I would have done the same thing if a pop star gave me attention, so like I can't blame him.
International playboy.
And the way that he thinks about his life, he's kind of ignoring everything that he doesn't want to deal with and holding on to that one good thing, this relationship with a pop star, was really relatable to me. I also loved Pablo's family. He comes from a divorced home. They all have a good relationship, but they just don't know what to do. And I love that. I think it was really realistic. And I think the ending of the novel where Pablo tries to get his life back and tries to like get on track with everything was really inspirational. And I love the message that it conveyed to its readers, especially the young adults that will go into this book and are kind of swimming in this like economy that we've kind of shoved them into. And I think that this book really works to show that you can get out of that and get your life on track. 1,000,000,000% of my decrease in enjoyment of this book has to do with the audiobook narrator. The way that this narrator narrated the women's lines. Oh my god, they sounded so nasally and annoying. And that's really questionable to me because it really tainted my enjoyment of the book, and it's because of the female characters, and I hate saying that. And I don't even think you were meant to detest the female characters, but the audio narration really made me feel that way. And because of this, I ended up really hating Lyanna Smart as a love interest, as a side character. I really didn't enjoy her at all. She felt really self-centered and rude, and I don't think she would have come off that way were I reading this physically rather than listening to it. I feel like I was being forced to not like Lyanna Smart, and that made me really uncomfortable. And she wasn't the only female character that had this voice. In fact, every single one in the book overall had this voice, and they just sounded really annoying, and like Pablo didn't like any of them, and it was really hard to appreciate these relationships with Pablo. So while I enjoyed the discussions that were presented in the book, I think the narration really made this a horrible experience for me, and I did give it 3.5 stars because of that. Next, I read another arc, and that is A Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth. This is kind of like City of Bones, but basically it's an urban fantasy that takes place in Ontario, and it follows a girl who is half fae, and her family kind of runs the spring court there, but she's kind of like an outcast to her family because she is a half-born. It also follows a exiled Fury who lives in Toronto and is kind of trying to solve some murders that are happening around her. And it also follows a prince from Las Vegas whose mom is in charge of the summer court. Basically, there's a string of murders that are occurring, and these three characters kind of come together in order to solve what's going on and help the fae community survive, last, whatever. So as you can tell, this book really left me feeling confused. It was a wild ride in a both good and bad way. And this book was very confusing. It's not because I finished it like 2 weeks ago that I can't remember what it was about. I literally couldn't figure out what it was about the entire time I was reading it. I was kind of lost. And part of this, I think, is due to its length. The book is 512 pages, and I really feel like because it is this YA urban fantasy, it could have worked extremely well were it 150 pages shorter. It also has 4 POVs. I know I mentioned 3 main characters, but one of the main characters, Guards, also has a POV, and I just feel like it was too much. Vehan and Aurelian, which are the prince and his guard, while their chapters were interesting and while they are like kind of intriguing characters, I just feel like their entire portion of the novel was unnecessary because they didn't really do anything, and they were kind of put in opposition to Arlo and Nausicaa, which are the half fae and Fury girls, and their plotline was just way more interesting. And so every time I got to Vehan and Aurelian's chapters, they kind of just felt lackluster in comparison because they, again, weren't really doing anything. I just didn't care about them because their location and arc in plot were just completely different, and I just feel like it just wasn't necessary. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed their story and I liked them as characters, but in comparison to the other main characters, they were just severely underdeveloped. So we did have these really exciting parts of the novel, but most of the additional pages and plot points just added to this aforementioned confusion. Additionally, the magic system in this book is not really explained, and it just added another layer of confusion because it's kind of like D&D mixed with like this understood seasonal fairy magic that I don't feel like I had, and I feel like it could be better explained, and she probably will do that in future installments of the book, but we were definitely like told a lot of things instead of shown, and it just left everything feeling confusing. I do want to say that it's amazing to get a sapphic relationship in urban fantasy, and it probably exists, but it's the first time that I've ever read it, so it was really nice to see. I know this review kind of makes it seem like I didn't enjoy this book. I did have a fun time. It kind of felt like City of Bones. It just felt like candy to me. I did enjoy it, but overall I did give it a 3 stars, and I don't think I will be continuing this series. Then I read a very exciting book, which is Thunderhead by Neil Shusterman. If you watched my best books of the year video, which I have already linked up above, Scythe made it to my list because it was perfection, and I'm happy to say that Thunderhead was the same. The first book in the series follows 2 main characters, Rowan and Citra, and they are kind of taken on as these scythe apprentices. Scythes in this world work to kind of keep the population at bay. There are no diseases anymore, no ways for human to die, so the only way that you can die in this world is to be gleaned by a scythe. And that's the kind of like bare bones synopsis of the book, but because it just takes so many left turns and you don't know what's happening and it's crazy. And I don't even have like a review for this book because I was just so shook Everything that I spoke about in my best books for Scythe can be applied here. The plot is amazing. The characters are amazing. Neil Shusterman's writing is amazing. Everything that he does keeps me so engaged. This book is 500 pages and I read it in 2 days. It is paced in such a magnificent way. It is quick, but everything that is on the page feels like it needs to be there. Every plot point, every part of the story is there on page for a reason. And when you finish the book, you're like, oh my god, everything has been leading up to this moment. I did just get The Toll in the mail, and that is the finale of the book. And I don't know how Neil Shusterman is going to wrap everything up because so much shit happened in this book and I was freaking out, and the whole time I was like, oh my god, it is so different. And from where the story starts in the first book to this one is just so crazy. Anyways, I'm getting flustered. This is a great book. If you haven't picked up this series yet, I highly recommend to do so. And I gave this obviously 5 stars. Then I decided to partake in the late night book club, and this is a book club hosted by Noelle, Elias, and Joel, and in the month of January they were reading The Shining by Stephen King. Surprisingly, I never read The Shining before nor watched the movies. Essentially, this book follows the Torrance family as the patriarch of the family loses his job at a school, and he's kind of running down on his luck looking for a job and takes it to be the winter manager of the Overlook Hotel. This hotel closes for the season, so Jack and his family will be there all alone at this hotel, kind of managing to make sure nothing happens to the hotel while everybody is gone. But obviously, in Stephen King fashion, something goes wrong. So I do see why this is one of Stephen King's most famous novels. Obviously, I knew the like vivid scenes of the movie, so like Come Play with Us, Danny, here's Johnny, here's Johnny, that kind of thing. So I knew like what I was going into. I kind of had an idea of where the story was gonna go. This is a good old-fashioned haunted house hotel story. Some of Stephen King's novels that I've read are not as spooky as I was expecting them to be, and I can confidently say that The Shining is super spooky. I really loved how it was never clear if the ghosts in the hotel were real or kind of products of this cabin fever imagination. King did, I think, an excellent job presenting this and making it a real fear. Just knowing that this family was at this hotel alone and seeing things really amped up the spook factor for me because I am terrified of being alone in spooky situations. I really enjoyed the family dynamics in this. I loved Danny as a character. He was so innocent and sweet, and this innocence really shines in comparison to the horrors of the hotel and his father's complete mental breakdown. Wendy was a really interesting main character as well. I really loved her as this motherly figure, and I feel like she could have had a more defining role in the novel. Jack, while I didn't necessarily care for him, I think he was an interesting character and horror that haunts the Torrance family, and by that I mean Wendy and Danny. I definitely think this book could have done without specific narrative scenes in the book, and particularly I'm talking about the moments with Dick Halloran. While they were sweet and while I really enjoy the only POC character in this novel, I don't feel like they really did anything for the plot in the end. And obviously, just speaking of the fact that Halloran is the only POC main character, obviously there was a lot of lingo in here a la Stephen King that just were not necessary and could not have been included. They didn't even need to be there, quite frankly. Despite the negatives I had with this book, I definitely see The Shining being a book I will continuously think about. I definitely think The Shining will be one of King's most memorable novels, at least for me, and I could definitely see myself rereading this in the future, and I gave it 4 stars. And finally, the last book I read, well, it's not really a book. The last thing I read in the month of January was a short story called Warm Up by V.E. Schwab. I have officially read everything V.E. Schwab has ever written. This is kind of a prequel short story before the events of Vicious and Vengeful. So this story follows a man named David who passed away prior to this short story, and because of his death, he has superpowers and he is able to heat things up with his hands. Honestly, this short story, while it's from one of my favorite series, I don't think really did much, in all honesty. I think this book would have actually worked much better as a prologue to the first book, which I think it technically is, but I feel like it should be included in the book itself. It definitely shows one of the 2 main characters from that series as the evil villain that they are. And although it's like kind of a spoiler, I think it's subtle enough to have worked really well as a prologue, like I said. Because of its format and because it was so short, I couldn't really bring myself to care about David at all. And I already knew how it was going to end just by the vibe of the story. It's cool to have knocked this off my list. Like I said, I've now officially read everything she's published so far, but it didn't do much else for me, and I gave it a 3 stars. And that's it. Those are all the books I read in the latter half of January. Please let me know if you've read any of these books. Did you like them? Did you hate them? Let me know down below in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell if you would like to see more content from me. It makes me feel really good. And I don't know how to end these things, so I guess I will see you next time. Bye!